For 100 years, we called them primitive. That was the word, primitive, and it carried everything we needed it to carry. It meant they were less than us. It meant the story of human prehistory was a story of progress, of one form replacing a lesser form, of Homo sapiens arriving in Europe and doing what superior beings do to inferior ones. We told that story with confidence. We put it in textbooks. We built museum dioramas around it. Heavy-browed, hunched figures clutching crude spears, looking up at the taller, smoother, smarter arrivals with something like confusion in their eyes. Then we sequenced their DNA. Then we dated their cave paintings. Then we found, buried in a cave in Spain, art that predated the arrival of any modern human in Europe by 20,000 years. And the story we had been telling, the clean, comfortable story of replacement, began to come apart. What we found in its place was not a simpler story. It was a harder one, and a stranger one, and in many ways a more remarkable one. We found a species that survived for 300,000 years in some of the harshest environments on Earth. We found evidence of burial, of jewellery, of pigment, of medicine, of love for the injured and the old. We found, written in the genomes of every living person of non-African descent, the molecular proof that at some point in the distant past, our ancestors looked at these beings we had decided were primitive and chose them. They were not primitive, they were people, and we have been wrong about them for a very long time. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story of how we came to misunderstand the Neanderthals so completely begins, as so many stories of misunderstanding do, with a first impression that no one thought to question for a very long time. In 1856, 3 years before Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, workers quarrying limestone in the Neander Valley near Dusseldorf in what is now Germany blasted open a cave and found bones. They found a skull cap, 2 femora, parts of a pelvis, and several other fragments. The remains of a being who had died in that cave at some point in the distant past. The workers thought the bones were from a bear. The quarry owner thought they might be worth keeping. A local school teacher named Johann Karl Fuhlrott examined them and understood immediately that they were not bear bones, and not the bones of any modern human being. He brought them to an anatomist named Hermann Schaffhausen, who presented them to the scientific community in 1857 with the suggestion that they represented a very ancient form of human being, a conclusion that was, for the time, remarkably prescient. The scientific community was not, on the whole, persuaded. The debate that followed the announcement of the Neander Valley bones is one of the more illuminating episodes in the history of science, not because of what the scientists got right, but because of what they refused to consider. The most influential anatomist in Europe at the time was a man named Rudolf Virchow, who examined the Neander Valley bones and declared them to be the remains of a modern human being who had suffered from rickets, arthritis, and a blow to the head. This explanation, the diseased modern human, became the dominant interpretation for years, not because the evidence supported it particularly well, but because the alternative was too unsettling to accept. An ancient, distinct form of human being walking the earth in the deep past implied a continuity between ourselves and something we did not want to be continuous with. The first full scientific description of what we now call Neanderthals was published in 1864 by the Irish geologist William King, who gave the species its formal name, Homo neanderthalensis, and who was one of the few scientists of his era willing to say plainly that what the Neander Valley bones represented was a distinct species of human being, related to us, but not us. King's view was a minority position for decades. The majority of scientists preferred interpretations that kept the Neanderthals comfortably outside the boundaries of what counted as truly human. The image of the Neanderthal that consolidated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries owed more to the cultural anxieties of the time than to careful analysis of the fossil evidence. When the French paleontologist Marcelin Boule published his famous reconstruction of a Neanderthal skeleton in 1911, a reconstruction that would define the popular image of the species for generations, he produced a figure that was stooped, shuffling, and dim. The individual whose bones Boule was reconstructing was, we now know, an elderly man who had suffered from severe arthritis, which explains the stooped posture, and whose spine and joints had been significantly altered by decades of disease. Boule knew about the arthritis. He reconstructed the stooped posture anyway, and then used it to argue that Neanderthals were fundamentally different from modern humans in their gait, their posture, and by implication, their cognitive capacity. It was a circular argument dressed in scientific language, and it worked. The image of the stooped, brutish Neanderthal entered the popular imagination and stayed there. It appeared in textbooks, in newspaper articles, in natural history museum dioramas, and eventually in film, the shuffling, grunting, primitive competitor to the sleek, clever Cro-Magnon. It became the default picture that most people carried in their heads when they thought about Neanderthals, and it was wrong in almost every particular. Dr. Elara is a paleoanthropologist at a university in France who has spent 30 years studying Neanderthal skeletal anatomy. She came into the field partly because of the dioramas, not because they inspired her, but because they offended her. Even as a student looking at those reconstructions with their slumped postures and vacant expressions, she found something hollow in them. The anatomy she was learning did not support the image she was being shown. The Neanderthal skeleton, studied carefully and without the interpretive overlay of a century of dismissal, tells a very different story. Neanderthal skeletons are robust. They're built for power in a way that modern human skeletons generally are not. Heavier bones, larger muscle attachment sites, broader chests, stronger hands. The barrel-chested physique that characterizes Neanderthal anatomy is not a sign of primitiveness. It is a sign of extraordinary physical conditioning, of bodies shaped by a life of sustained physical effort in demanding environments. The bone density of Neanderthal skeletons is consistently higher than that of modern humans from the same time periods, which tells us something about the mechanical loads those bodies were routinely carrying. They were not stooped. They stood as upright as we do. The stooped posture of Boule's reconstruction was an artifact of a diseased skeleton and a predetermined conclusion, not an accurate representation of Neanderthal anatomy. The brain is where the comparison becomes most interesting. Neanderthals had brains that were, on average, slightly larger than modern human brains. Not smaller, not less complex in gross anatomy, but larger. This is not what the old narrative would lead you to expect. Brain size is not a simple proxy for intelligence. The relationship between brain size and cognitive capacity is far more complex than that. But the fact that Neanderthal brains were large, and that the regions of the brain associated with vision and motor control appear to have been particularly well developed, tells us something about the cognitive profile of the species. They were not the small-brained, mentally limited beings that the traditional narrative required them to be. They were something more interesting and more complicated than that. Dr. Elara has spent a significant part of her career studying the injuries recorded in Neanderthal skeletons, and what she has found is a story not of brutishness but of care. Neanderthal skeletons frequently show evidence of serious injuries, broken bones, healed wounds, deformities from accidents or disease, that the individual survived for years or decades after sustaining them. A Neanderthal from Shanidar Cave in Iraq, known as Shanidar 1, had survived to middle age despite suffering injuries that had left him partially blind, deaf in one ear, and with a withered right arm that had been amputated or had atrophied to the point of uselessness. He could not have hunted effectively with those injuries. He could not have fully participated in the physical labor that Neanderthal life required. He survived anyway for years, which means that the people around him kept him alive. They fed him, they cared for him, they didn't abandon him when he became a burden, because caring for the vulnerable was part of what it meant to be a Neanderthal. This is not what primitive beings do. This is what people do. Our three companions tonight come to this story from different places, and each of them carries a different piece of it. There is Dr. Alara, the paleoanthropologist in France, who has spent her career pushing back against the caricature of the brutish Neanderthal, and who has found, in the bones themselves, the evidence of a species more sophisticated than the textbooks allowed. There is Marcus, a geneticist in a university in the United Kingdom, whose own genome, sequenced as part of a research project a few years ago, showed him that he carries approximately 2.1% Neanderthal DNA, slightly above the average for Europeans, and who has spent considerable time since then thinking about what it means to carry within yourself the molecular trace of a people who no longer exist. And there is Dr. Su Jin, an archaeologist working in the caves of southern Spain and northern France, who has dedicated the last 15 years of her career to understanding the objects that Neanderthals made and left behind, the tools, the pigments, the jewellery, the evidence of a symbolic life that the old narrative said they were incapable of. The world that the Neanderthals inhabited was the world of the Pleistocene, the same geological epoch that shaped the Denisovans and that formed the backdrop for the emergence of modern humans in Africa. The Neanderthals occupied Europe and Western Asia for at least 300,000 years across a period of dramatic climatic variability. They survived multiple glacial cycles, periods of intense cold during which ice sheets advanced across northern Europe, and the distribution of habitats across the continent shifted dramatically. They survived interglacial periods of relative warmth. They adapted again and again to environments that changed around them in ways that would challenge the adaptive capacity of any species. The Neanderthal range, at its greatest extent, stretched from the Atlantic coast of what is now Portugal and Spain in the west to the Altai Mountains of Siberia in the east, the same Altai Mountains where the Denisovans have been found, which is itself a significant fact. The southern extent of their range reached into the Middle East, where Neanderthal fossils have been found at sites like Shanidar Cave in Iraq and Kabara Cave in Israel. In the north, they lived as far as the edge of the periglacial zone, the frigid landscape at the margins of the ice sheets, surviving conditions that few modern humans without technological support could manage. The environments they occupied were varied in ways that required genuine adaptive flexibility. The cold steppes of northern Europe, where woolly mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses and cave lions moved across open grasslands under grey skies. The temperate forests of Central Europe, where deer and aurochs and wild boar provided different opportunities and required different hunting strategies. The rugged limestone landscapes of southern France and northern Spain, where the caves that would eventually preserve so much of the Neanderthal record opened into cliff faces above river valleys. The arid uplands of the Middle East, where the resources available were different again, and where the Neanderthals who lived there had adapted to yet another set of conditions. The picture of a species that could survive across this range of environments, across 300,000 years of climatic change, is not the picture of a limited or inflexible species. It is the picture of a species with genuine adaptive capacity, with the behavioral flexibility to respond to changing conditions, to exploit different resources, to modify their strategies as the landscape required. The traditional narrative of the Neanderthals as a static, unchanging, ultimately maladaptive species cannot survive contact with the evidence of how long they lasted and how much territory they occupied. Marcus thinks about the Neanderthal range in terms of the landscapes his ancestors moved through. He grew up in Wales, in a valley that would, during the periods of maximum Neanderthal occupation of Europe, have been at the very edge of the habitable world, a cold, demanding landscape of grass and rock and seasonal extremes. Neanderthals lived in Wales, not in a metaphorical or genetic sense, but literally. Their bones have been found in caves in the Welsh mountains, evidence of people who walked those specific hills and hunted in those specific valleys. When Marcus hikes in the mountains near where he grew up, he sometimes thinks about this. The same landscape, different people, the same hills, the same rain, the same rock under different feet. The question of what Neanderthals made, what objects they produced, what technologies they developed, what their material culture tells us about their inner lives, is one that has been transformed almost beyond recognition over the past 2 decades. The old answer was simple. Neanderthals made relatively crude stone tools. They did not make art. They did not engage in symbolic behavior, and the absence of these things was evidence of a fundamental cognitive difference between them and modern humans. The new answer is considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting. The stone tool tradition most closely associated with the Neanderthal is called the Mousterian, named after the Le Moustier rock shelter in the Dordogne region of France, where a characteristic assemblage of tools was first described. Mousterian tools are not crude. They are the product of a sophisticated and demanding set of techniques. The Levallois technique in particular, which involves the careful preparation of a stone core to allow the removal of a flake of predetermined size and shape, requires a level of forward planning and spatial reasoning that is not trivial. You cannot produce a good Levallois flake by accident. You have to understand the 3-dimensional geometry of the stone, plan the sequence of removals in advance, and execute that plan with precision. This is the kind of task that researchers use as a test of planning ability and spatial cognition, and the Neanderthals were doing it routinely for hundreds of thousands of years. Dr. Sujin learned the Levallois technique herself. She spent several months working with an experimental archaeologist who had devoted years to mastering the flint knapping skills of the Paleolithic. She wanted to understand from the inside what the technique required, what kind of mind it demanded. What she found was humbling. The technique is genuinely difficult. It requires sustained attention, fine motor control, the ability to read the internal structure of a stone from its external surface, and a capacity for forward planning that extends across many individual actions. A novice flint knapper, even an intelligent and motivated one, takes months to produce acceptable Levallois flakes. The Neanderthals were producing them with a consistency and regularity that implies long apprenticeships, the transfer of skill from one generation to the next, and a tradition of technical knowledge that was maintained and transmitted across time. The transmission of technical knowledge across generations requires teaching. It requires the ability to demonstrate, to correct, to explain, perhaps not with language in the full modern sense, but with some form of intentional communication that goes beyond simple imitation. The idea that Neanderthals had no meaningful capacity for communication, that they grunted rather than spoke, that they lacked the cognitive machinery for anything like language, has been significantly complicated by the discovery that Neanderthals had the same FOXP2 gene variant as modern humans. FOXP2 is involved in the fine motor control of the vocal apparatus, and mutations in it produce severe language impairments in modern humans. Its presence in the Neanderthal genome does not prove that they had language. The relationship between genes and complex behaviors is never that simple, but it removes one of the few pieces of genetic evidence that had been used to argue they lacked it. The hyoid bone, the small, horseshoe-shaped bone in the throat that anchors the muscles of the tongue and larynx, has been recovered from Neanderthal remains at Kebara Cave in Israel, and its shape and size are essentially identical to the modern human hyoid. The anatomy of the Neanderthal vocal tract, reconstructed from the available skeletal evidence, suggest that they were capable of producing a range of sounds similar to those that modern humans produce. Whether they organized those sounds into a system of meaning, whether they had something we would recognize as language, is a question that the bones cannot answer. But the anatomy does not rule it out, and the evidence of the technical traditions they maintain, the knowledge they passed from generation to generation, suggests that some form of intentional communication was almost certainly part of their life. Dr. Sujin's particular focus is not on stone tools, but on what she calls the softer evidence. The pigments, the shells, the ornaments, the traces of behaviours that do not preserve easily, and that took a long time for archaeologists to take seriously. She has spent years working at sites in Spain and France, and what she's found there has changed her understanding of what Neanderthals were capable of. In the cave of Ardals in southern Spain, the walls are covered with red ochre pigment, patches and streaks and handprints of red, applied by beings who entered the deep cave at some point in the distant past and left a mark that has survived to the present day. For a long time, these markings were attributed to modern humans. It seemed obvious that modern humans, with their well-documented capacity for cave art, were responsible. Then the dating results came back. The oldest pigment marks in the cave of Ardales are more than 65,000 years old. Modern humans did not arrive in Europe until at least 45,000 years ago. The marks were made necessarily by Neanderthals. This finding, published in 2018, and the subject of significant scientific debate since, is one of the most important discoveries in the study of Neanderthal cognition. It means that Neanderthals entered a dark cave, not a lit entrance where the sunlight reached, but the deep cave, the part that requires a light source to navigate, and applied pigment to the walls. They selected a specific pigment, they carried it into the darkness, they chose where to apply it. Whatever the act meant to them, and we cannot know what it meant to them, it was not an accidental or unconsidered act. It was intentional. It was, by any reasonable definition, symbolic behaviour. The debate that followed the Ardales dating results illuminates something important about how science works when its findings challenge established narratives. Several researchers questioned the methodology of the uranium-thorium dating that produced the 65,000-year dates. The questioning was not unreasonable. Uranium-thorium dating of cave carbonates is a technically demanding procedure with known sources of error. But the sheer persistence of the questioning, the number of alternative explanations that were proposed and then had to be ruled out one by one, suggested something beyond ordinary scientific skepticism. The Neanderthal cave art was not just a scientific finding. It was a challenge to a story that people had built careers and identities around, and the resistance to it was proportional to its significance. The evidence ultimately has held. Further dating work at Ardales and at other sites, La Pasiega, Maltravieso, Cueva de los Aviones, has confirmed pre-modern human dates for pigment use and for the collection and perforation of marine shells for use as personal ornaments. At Cueva de los Aviones, eagle talons have been found with cut marks that indicate deliberate removal from the bird and wear patterns consistent with having been strung together as a necklace. Eagle talons are not food. You do not remove eagle talons from a bird because you are hungry. You remove them because you find them beautiful, or because they carry meaning for you, or because you want to wear them, to display something about yourself to the world. The Neanderthals who made that necklace were doing something that we recognize across all the distance of time and species as a fundamentally human act. The treatment of the dead is one of the most revealing tests of a species' inner life. What a population does with its dead tells us something about whether those individuals understood death as an event with meaning beyond the biological, whether they had a concept of the person who had died that persisted after the body ceased to function. It is one of the behaviours that researchers most consistently associate with the kind of reflective consciousness that we think of as distinctively human. Neanderthals buried their dead. This has been known since the early 20th century, and it has been contested almost as long. The site most commonly associated with Neanderthal burial is Shanidar Cave in Iraqi Kurdistan, where 9 Neanderthal individuals have been recovered over decades of excavation. One of them, Shanidar 4, was found in 1960 surrounded by what appeared to be the remains of flowers. The archaeologist who made the find, Ralph Selecki, interpreted the pollen associated with the skeleton as evidence that the dead individual had been laid to rest on a bed of wildflowers, a finding that, if correct, would imply a funeral ritual, a deliberate beautification of the burial, and a care for the dead that would be impossible to dismiss as anything other than symbolic and emotionally resonant behaviour. The flower burial has been questioned. The pollen, some researchers have suggested, could have been introduced by burrowing rodents who carried plant material into the cave after the burial took place. This is a legitimate alternative explanation, and it cannot be entirely ruled out. What is harder to dismiss is the broader pattern of Neanderthal treatment of the dead across multiple sites and multiple time periods. At La Ferracie in France, several Neanderthal individuals were buried in what appear to be deliberate graves, hollowed depressions in the cave floor, bodies placed in specific positions, occasionally with grave goods. At Kabara Cave in Israel, a Neanderthal adult male was buried in a pit, placed on his back, with only the skull missing, suggesting that the skull may have been deliberately removed after burial, which implies a relationship with the dead body that extended beyond the moment of death. At Roc de Marsalle in France, a Neanderthal child was buried in a pit that shows signs of having been deliberately excavated. The pattern, across these sites and others, is consistent enough to suggest that deliberate burial of the dead was a real Neanderthal practice, even if the specific details of individual cases remain contested. Whether that practice was accompanied by the kind of ritual and belief that modern human burial practices typically involve, beliefs about an afterlife, about the continued existence of the person after death, about the relationship between the living and the dead, is something we cannot determine from the physical evidence alone. But the practice itself, the deliberate placement of a body in the earth, the choice to mark the end of a life in a way that goes beyond simply leaving the body where it fell, is a behaviour that implies something about how Neanderthals understood death and what it meant to them. Dr. Alara has worked at several Neanderthal burial sites, and she has found the experience of excavating a deliberately interred skeleton different in kind from the experience of excavating scattered or disarticulated remains. There is something in the arrangement of a deliberate burial, the care with which the body was placed, the orientation of the limbs, the objects that were or were not included, that communicates intention across the vast distance of time. She's careful not to romanticize the interpretation. The evidence is what it is, and what it is does not always speak clearly. But she has spent enough time with Neanderthal burials to be convinced that the beings who made them were not acting on instinct alone. They were acting on something that looked, from the outside at least, very much like grief. Marcus finds the burial evidence the most affecting part of the Neanderthal story. He is a geneticist by training, comfortable with the abstraction of sequence data and population models, but the image of a Neanderthal being laid carefully in the earth by people who had known them, who had hunted alongside them, shared fire with them, spoken to them in whatever form their speech took, is not abstract. It is immediate. It is recognizable. Whatever the specifics of what the mourners believed or felt, the act of placing a body in the ground and choosing not to leave it to the elements is an act that any modern human who has lost someone can recognize without difficulty. The gap between us and the Neanderthals in that specific moment is narrower than 100 years of diorama making would have us believe. One of the most unexpected findings in recent Neanderthal research is the evidence for the use of medicinal plants. The discovery came from an analysis of the dental calculus, the hardened plaque, preserved on the teeth of Neanderthal individuals from a site called El Sidron in northern Spain. Dental calculus is a remarkable archive of an individual's diet and behaviour because it traps microscopic traces of everything that entered the mouth over a lifetime. Food particles, plant fibres, bacteria, and the residues of anything else that was chewed or held in the mouth. When researchers analysed the calculus from the El Sidron Neanderthals, they found something they did not expect. They found yarrow, they found groundsel, they found chamomile, they found poplar. These are not food plants in any conventional sense. Yarrow and chamomile are bitter and unpalatable, groundsel is mildly toxic, and while poplar bark has some nutritional value, it is not something you would eat casually. All of them have medicinal properties that have been recognised by human cultures across the world. Yarrow is an analgesic and anti-inflammatory. Chamomile has long been used to treat digestive complaints and to promote sleep. Poplar bark contains salicin, the compound from which aspirin was eventually synthesized, which is an effective painkiller and fever reducer. The Neanderthals at El Sidron were not eating these plants for nutrition. They were, with a high degree of probability, using them for their pharmacological effects. This finding, if accepted, and it has been critically examined and has largely survived that examination, implies a level of knowledge about the natural world that goes considerably beyond what the traditional narrative of the Neanderthal mind would permit. You cannot discover that yarrow reduces pain by accident. You have to observe the effect, connect it to the cause, remember the connection, and apply the knowledge deliberately in future situations. You have to teach it to others, because knowledge that dies with its discoverer is not particularly useful to a population. The Neanderthals who used medicinal plants were applying empirical knowledge about the natural world, knowledge that had been accumulated through observation and preserved through some form of transmission between generations. The diet of the Neanderthals, more broadly, has been revised significantly in recent decades. For a long time, the assumption was that Neanderthals were primarily, perhaps exclusively, meat eaters. The robust skeleton, the large canine teeth, the isotopic evidence from some sites suggesting that their diet was heavily weighted toward large herbivores. All of this was used to support the image of the Neanderthal as a pure carnivore. The image was never entirely convincing, because no large omnivore with access to plant foods would ignore them entirely, and the dental calculus analysis has confirmed what should perhaps have been assumed all along. Neanderthals ate plants. They ate a variety of plants, including starchy tubers that they appear to have cooked. The dental calculus contains residues of cooked starch, which means they were preparing plant food with heat, which means they understood that heating certain foods changes them in useful ways. This is not the diet of a creature incapable of planning or learning. This is the diet of an omnivore with a detailed knowledge of their environment, who knew what was edible and what was not, who knew what was medicinal and what was merely bitter, who knew how to process food to make it more nutritious or more digestible. The Neanderthal relationship with their environment was not the simple, reactive relationship of a predator following prey. It was the complex, knowledge-rich relationship of a species that had been paying careful attention to its landscape for a very long time. Dr. Sujin finds the medicinal plant evidence the most personally moving part of the story, for a reason that she is slightly embarrassed by, but that she does not try to hide. Her grandmother was an herbalist, a woman in rural Korea who had spent her life accumulating knowledge about the plants of her specific landscape, their properties, their uses, their dangers. Dr. Sujin grew up with that knowledge in the background of her life, watching her grandmother move through the fields and hillsides with a certainty and a purpose that she now recognizes as something ancient. The Neanderthals at El Sidron, who held yarrow in their mouths and felt their pain diminish, were doing something that her grandmother did. The specific plants were different. The specific pain was different, but the act, the deliberate application of plant knowledge to the alleviation of suffering, was the same act. It crossed 80,000 years without losing its essential character. Sometime between 60 and 45,000 years ago, the ancestors of every non-African person alive today began moving out of Africa and into the territories that the Neanderthals had occupied for hundreds of thousands of years. This was not a single migration or a single moment. It was a process that unfolded over thousands of years, as populations spread along coastlines and river systems and through mountain passes, exploring and eventually inhabiting every corner of Eurasia and beyond. The Neanderthals knew they were there. We know this because the genetic evidence is unambiguous. The ancestors of modern humans and the Neanderthals met, and they interbred. Most people of non-African descent carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA, a proportion that varies by population and by the specific ancestry of the individual, but that is real and measurable in virtually every non-African genome that has been sequenced. This DNA did not get there by accident. It got there because, at some point in the past, probably multiple points, in multiple locations, modern humans and Neanderthals had children together. Marcus has spent considerable time thinking about the 2.1% of his genome that traces to Neanderthals. The number is small, but it is not trivial. Across the entire human genome, 2.1% represents thousands of genetic variants, specific differences in the molecular sequence of his DNA that trace their origin not to any modern human ancestor, but to a being who lived in Europe before modern humans arrived there, who had evolved there for 300,000 years, and who was, in some meaningful biological sense, not quite the same kind of person as the modern humans who eventually took his place. The question of what the meeting between modern humans and Neanderthals was actually like, what the encounters looked like, what the participants thought of each other, how the interbreeding was experienced, is one that the genetic evidence can sketch the outlines of but cannot fill in. We know the interbreeding happened. We do not know if it was consensual or coerced, welcomed or resisted, common or rare. We do not know if the mixed ancestry offspring were accepted by their communities or rejected, whether they lived among modern humans or Neanderthals or in some in-between space that we have no category for. What the genetics can tell us is that the interbreeding was not symmetrical. Modern human DNA flowed into the Neanderthal gene pool, but the reverse flow was limited. The genetic signatures that would indicate significant Neanderthal ancestry in the modern human line are present, but they are not large. This asymmetry tells us something about the demographic reality of the encounter. The modern human populations moving into Neanderthal territory were, in all likelihood, larger and more rapidly expanding than the Neanderthal populations they were encountering. The Neanderthals, as we have established, had been a relatively small and fragmented population for a very long time. They were meeting a population that was, in purely demographic terms, more numerous, more connected, and expanding into their range. The traditional narrative frames this as conquest, the smart, aggressive moderns displacing the slow, stupid archaics. The actual picture appears to be considerably more complicated. There is no clear evidence of systematic violence between modern humans and Neanderthals. No battlefield sites, no mass graves that could be attributed to conflict between the two species. What there is evidence of coexistence, at least for a period in several regions of Europe. Sites where both Mousterian tools and the more recent Aurignacian technology that is associated with modern humans appear in successive layers, sometimes separated by only a few thousand years, sometimes overlapping in ways that suggest genuine contemporaneity. At some sites, archaeologists have found what they call transitional industries, tool assemblages that combine features of Mousterian technology with features of the newer Aurignacian. These transitional industries are one of the most debated topics in Paleolithic archaeology, partly because they are difficult to interpret and partly because what they might mean, that Neanderthals were adopting modern human technologies, or that modern humans were adopting Neanderthal technologies, or that the two populations were exchanging ideas as well as genes, has significant implications for how we understand the cognitive capabilities of Neanderthals. A species that cannot learn new technologies from another species is cognitively limited in a way that matters. A species that can observe, understand, and adopt a new technology, that can look at what someone else is doing, recognize it as better than what they're doing, and change its behavior accordingly, is not. Dr. Su Jin has argued in her academic work that some of the transitional industries represent exactly this kind of learning, that the Neanderthals who produced them had encountered modern human toolmakers, had understood what those toolmakers were doing, and had incorporated elements of the new technology into their own tradition. The argument is contested, as most significant arguments in this field are, but it is not implausible, and the alternative, that the transitional industries are simply the result of mixing between populations, with no individual learning involved, requires its own set of assumptions about how technology spreads between populations, assumptions that may not be better supported than the learning hypothesis. The Neanderthals are gone as a distinct population. The last of them died somewhere in Europe, probably in the south, the Iberian Peninsula, or possibly the British Isles, where modern humans arrived late, sometime between 40 and 35,000 years ago. The exact timing and location of the last Neanderthal population is not known, and may never be known with precision, because the fossil record from this period is sparse, and the genetic evidence, while informative about the broad patterns of population history, cannot tell us which specific cave or valley saw the final fire of a distinct lineage go cold. What survived the Neanderthals is more than most people realize, and different in character from what the traditional narrative would suggest. The most obvious survival is the genetic one. Every person of non-African descent carries Neanderthal DNA, and that DNA is not simply a molecular fossil. It is functional. It affects biology. It has been shaped by natural selection in the time since it was first incorporated into the modern human gene pool. Some Neanderthal gene variants have been retained in modern human populations at high frequencies because they provide genuine advantages in the environments where the people who carry them live. Neanderthal variants of immune system genes, particularly HLA genes, which encode proteins that allow the immune system to recognize pathogens, are found at elevated frequencies in European and Asian populations relative to what you would expect from random genetic drift alone. This pattern suggests that when modern humans moved into the environments that Neanderthals had been occupying for hundreds of thousands of years, they encountered a disease landscape that the Neanderthals had already adapted to. The Neanderthal HLA, variants that were incorporated into the modern human gene pool through interbreeding, provided a partial pre-adaptation to the pathogens of the Neanderthal range, a biological inheritance that helped the newcomers survive in a new and immunologically challenging environment. Marcus finds it remarkable that his immune system, the specific constellation of proteins on the surface of his immune cells that determines how well he can fight off the pathogens of Europe, was shaped in part by the Neanderthals who lived in Europe before his ancestors arrived. He did not inherit it consciously, and neither did the Neanderthal who contributed it. The genetic exchange that put those variants into the modern human gene pool was the product of individual encounters between specific people at specific moments, encounters that neither party understood as the immunological transaction it was. And yet the consequence of those encounters persists in the immune system of a geneticist in a university in the United Kingdom 70,000 years later. There are Neanderthal gene variants associated with hair texture and skin tone in modern European populations, variants that may have helped modern humans adapt to the lower ultraviolet light levels of European latitudes, where darker skin is less advantageous than it is in Africa. There are Neanderthal variants associated with sleep patterns, the circadian rhythm genes, that are found at higher frequencies in populations from higher latitudes, where the extreme seasonality of light levels may have made certain sleep phenotypes advantageous. There are Neanderthal variants associated with increased susceptibility to certain modern diseases, depression, blood clotting disorders, allergies, variants that may have been advantageous in the Pleistocene environment, but that have become liabilities in the modern one. The Neanderthal inheritance is not purely beneficial. It is a mixed inheritance, shaped by the specific conditions of a specific time and place, carried forward by people living in conditions that Neanderthals could not have imagined. The cultural inheritance is harder to trace, because culture does not preserve in the way that genes do. But the period of coexistence between modern humans and Neanderthals, however long it lasted and wherever it occurred, was a period of potential exchange in both directions. The Châtel-Perronian tool industry, found at sites in France and Spain, contains elements that suggest either Neanderthal innovation or Neanderthal adoption of modern human techniques, and it dates to a period when both populations were present in Europe. The possibility that modern humans learned things from Neanderthals, specific techniques, specific knowledge about specific landscapes, specific solutions to specific problems, is not supported by direct evidence in the way that genetic exchange is, but it is not implausible either. People who live in the same landscape and encounter each other over thousands of years do not exchange only genes. The question of what we owe the Neanderthals is not a scientific question. It is a moral and philosophical one, and it is one that the new understanding of Neanderthal cognitive sophistication and of our genetic relationship with them makes it impossible to entirely avoid. For most of the history of the study of Neanderthals, the question did not arise, because the Neanderthals of the textbooks and the dioramas were not beings who raised the question. They were, in the traditional narrative, the also-rans of evolution, capable enough to survive for a while in the demanding environments of Pleistocene Europe, but ultimately outcompeted and replaced by the better adapted modern humans who arrived from Africa. This narrative made the Neanderthals interesting as scientific data, but did not make them interesting as subjects of moral consideration. You do not owe anything to a failed evolutionary experiment, but the Neanderthals of the evidence, the Neanderthals who buried their dead and cared for their injured, and made jewellery from eagle talons and painted in the deep darkness of Spanish caves, and held bitter plants in their mouths because they had learned that those plants could ease suffering. Those Neanderthals raise a different kind of question. If they were, as the evidence increasingly suggests, beings with rich inner lives, with forms of culture and communication and symbolic thought, with care for one another and knowledge of the world they lived in, then their disappearance is not simply the replacement of an inferior form by a superior one. It is the loss of a way of being in the world that had existed for 300,000 years and that we can never fully recover. Dr. Alara thinks about this loss in terms of what we cannot know. Every Neanderthal group that disappeared took with it specific knowledge, specific understanding of specific landscapes, specific plants, specific animals, specific seasons, knowledge that had been accumulated over hundreds of generations of careful attention and that was transmitted from person to person across time. When the last Neanderthal population went, all of that knowledge went with them. We have fragments, the medicinal plants in the dental calculus, the tools, the pigments on the cave walls, but we do not have the knowledge itself, the living tradition of understanding that those fragments represent. We have the residue of a way of knowing the world, but not the knowledge. Marcus does not find the question of what we owe the Neanderthals particularly difficult to answer, perhaps because he approaches it through the lens of what he carries. He carries their DNA. In some specific and not merely metaphorical sense, they are part of him. The question of what we owe the Neanderthals is, for Marcus, part of the larger question of what any of us owe the ancestors we carry inside us. The people whose existence made our existence possible, whose suffering and intelligence and love shaped the biological inheritance we were born into, and who we can never fully know or fully thank. Dr. Sujin's answer is simpler, and she thinks it is better. What we owe the Neanderthals is accuracy. We owe them the effort to see them clearly, to set aside the comfortable narrative of their inferiority, to look honestly at what the evidence says about who they were and how they lived. We spent 100 years getting them wrong, and the getting wrong was not innocent. It served purposes, reinforced assumptions, told a story about human progress that was more satisfying than the messier truth. We owe it to them to tell the messier truth. That is the only obligation that science can discharge, and the only one she's in a position to fulfill. The last Neanderthal populations lived in refugia, small, isolated pockets of habitable territory in the south and west of Europe, where the conditions were mild enough to support a small group, and where modern human expansion had not yet fully arrived. They had been contracting for a long time. The genetic evidence from late Neanderthal populations shows the same patterns that were found in the Denisovans, runs of homozygosity, the signature of small inbreeding populations that have been isolated from each other for too long. The Neanderthal populations of the final millennia were islands, separated from each other by the advancing tide of modern human settlement, too small to be fully robust, too isolated to benefit from the genetic and cultural exchange that had sustained them through previous periods of difficulty. The end, when it came, was probably not dramatic. There was no last stand, no final battle, no moment of catastrophe that a witness could have identified as the extinction of a species. There was instead the slow accumulation of individual losses, births that did not come, winters that were too hard, groups that did not find each other in time. The last Neanderthal did not know they were the last. They did not experience themselves as the final representative of a 300,000-year lineage. They experienced themselves as a person in a specific place, in a specific moment, with whatever joys and difficulties that moment contained. The ending of their line was not their experience. It was the absence of what came after them. Dr. Alara thinks sometimes about what that last group would have looked like. Small, probably very small, a few dozen people at most, occupying a territory that had been occupied by their ancestors for as long as anyone could remember, making the tools they had always made in the way they had always made them, knowing the landscape around them with an intimacy that comes from generations of accumulated attention, caring for each other, feeding the sick, mourning the dead, keeping the fire going through the cold nights, not knowing that the world was changing around them in a way that would eventually close in on them from all sides, not knowing that they were the last. There is grief in that image, if you let yourself feel it. The grief is not sentimental. It is not the projection of modern emotions onto beings who may have experienced the world very differently from how we experience it. It is the grief that attaches to any irreversible loss, the recognition that something real and complex and irreplaceable was in the world, and then was not and cannot be recovered. The cave paintings in Spain are the most vivid expression of that loss. 65,000 years ago, a Neanderthal entered a dark cave and pressed red pigment to the wall. The pigment is still there. The hand that applied it is not. We carry the Neanderthals in our bodies. This is not a metaphor. The DNA of Neanderthal individuals who lived and died in Europe and Western Asia tens of thousands of years ago is present in small but real and functional quantities in the genomes of most people alive today. It shapes immune systems, it influences sleep, It affects the likelihood of certain diseases. It may touch, in ways that are still being investigated, aspects of cognition and behaviour that we do not yet understand clearly enough to characterise. The STAT2 gene variant found in Neanderthal-derived DNA, present at elevated frequencies in some modern populations, appears to modulate the immune response to certain viral infections. The BNC2 variant of Neanderthal origin is associated with skin pigmentation and freckling in Europeans. The SLC16A11 variant, which increases the risk of type 2 diabetes in modern Latin American populations, traces to Neanderthal ancestry, a variant that may have been advantageous in the Pleistocene metabolic environment, but that interacts poorly with the modern diet. The Neanderthal inheritance is not tidy, and it is not uniformly positive. It is the inheritance of a specific time and a specific place, carried forward into a world that the Neanderthals who contributed it could not have imagined. Marcus finds the diabetes finding the most philosophically interesting aspect of his Neanderthal ancestry. A variant that helped a Neanderthal survive a specific kind of metabolic stress in a Pleistocene environment is, in certain modern contexts, a liability. The person who carries it did not choose it. It arrived in their genome through a chain of inheritance that stretches back 60,000 years, through individuals who could not have known what they were passing on or to whom. The Neanderthal who first carried that variant, the individual in whom it arose by mutation, or who acquired it from a population that had already developed it, was, in some specific environmental sense, advantaged by it. The person who carries it today, eating food that didn't exist in the Pleistocene, living in a metabolic environment that Pleistocene selection could not have anticipated, may not be. This is not a moral failing of the Neanderthals, it is the ordinary tragedy of adaptation, the solutions of one time becoming the problems of another. But the overall picture of the Neanderthal genetic contribution to modern humans is not one of burden, it is one of legacy. The HLA variants that help modern Europeans and Asians resist the specific pathogens of their environments. The sleep variants that help populations at high latitudes manage the extreme seasonality of light. The skin and pigmentation variants that helped modern humans adapt to the lower UV environments of northern latitudes. These are not small things. These are contributions to the survival and flourishing of human populations in the specific environments they inhabit. Contributions that were made not by any deliberate act of generosity on the part of the Neanderthals who carried them, but by the simple biological fact of encounter, of meeting, of the willingness of two kinds of people to see in each other something worth approaching. Dr. Lara is in her office in France, looking at a cast of a Neanderthal skull that sits on her desk. A replica, not the original, but close enough to the original that she can see, every time she looks at it, the broad forehead, the prominent brow ridges, the large eye sockets, the face of someone who was and was not like her. She has looked at it every day for 15 years. She does not find it less interesting than she did at the beginning. She finds it more interesting because 15 years of learning have given her more ways to see what is in front of her, more frameworks for understanding what the skull represents, more questions to ask of it, more appreciation for how much it still refuses to answer. Marcus is at his desk, running a genomic analysis on a data set of European population samples, and somewhere in the pipeline is the code that will flag the Neanderthal-derived variants in each genome, the specific positions in the DNA sequence where the modern human version and the Neanderthal version differ, and where some of these individuals carry the older form. He will look at the output tomorrow. It will show him, as it always does, the traces of meetings that happened 60,000 years ago, distributed across the genomes of people who are alive today, going about their lives, mostly unaware that they carry this particular kind of history inside them. Dr. Sujin is in a cave in northern Spain, in a section of the cave that most tourists never reach, in the dark beyond the reach of the electric lights that illuminate the main chamber. She's standing in front of a patch of red ochre on the cave wall that is 65,000 years old. She's not studying it tonight, she's just looking at it. She's looked at it many times in the context of her research with the analytical attention that her profession requires. Tonight she's looking at it the way you look at something when you have given up trying to understand it and are simply trying to feel it. Someone stood here, in this specific darkness, in this specific cave, with a light source that has long since vanished and a hand that has long since crumbled to dust. Someone pressed red pigment to this wall. They were not modern humans in our sense. They were not the beings in the dioramas either, not the stooped, vacant-eyed caricatures that a century of misunderstanding produced. They were people, in some sense of that word that we have not yet fully worked out, and they left this mark, and it has lasted 65,000 years, and Dr. Sujin is standing in front of it in the dark of a Spanish cave in the 21st century, and she is thinking about what it means that it is still here. She doesn't have an answer. The cave does not offer one. What it offers instead is the simple, irreducible fact of the mark itself, the evidence of a presence, an intention, a choice. Someone was here. Someone made this. Whatever else we do not know about the Neanderthals, we know that. They were here. They made things. They cared for each other. They buried their dead. They painted in the dark. And something of them, small, molecular, real, persists in the bodies of the people standing in their caves and analysing their bones and sequencing their genomes and wondering, as we will probably wonder for a very long time, what it was like to be them. This has been Midnight Chronicles. Sleep well, wherever in the world you are tonight.